Okay, well, good afternoon, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to be letting a few more people in. But do, as you come on in, feel free to turn your videos on, as it's always nice to kind of see who's joining us, but we know that that doesn't work for everybody. We are doing quick introductions in the chat of kind of where you're joining us from today and possibly why you're interested in learning more about COP27, Conference of the Parties. But we're going to go ahead and kick things off here. You hopefully are here to learn more about what the heck is this COP27 thing from our amazing Director of Programs at Climate Generation, Kristen Poppleton. Climate Generation does begin every presentation that we do with a land acknowledgement. We take time to acknowledge the native land we're on because one of the effects of genocide and colonization is that it can be easy to forget that we are still occupying land and that Indigenous individuals and communities are still alive and leading change in our world. We also recognize the tremendous resilience and innovative climate solutions that are created by these communities, and we seek to raise up their voices in climate change education. We are proud of the incredible diversity of our country and know that our vision for an equitable future will only be achieved when people work together, bridging experiences and expertise from across the globe. So just a very quick overview of who the heck Climate Generation is. Climate Generation was founded in 2006 by National Geographic polar explorer Will Steger, a lifelong science educator and eyewitness to climate change through 50 years of polar exploration. And Will truly believed that educators were the change makers in our communities and that sharing personal connections and stories was a key solution to climate change impacts and climate action. We always like to kind of explain why are we doing a workshop series for educators, really because Climate Generation's vision of igniting and sustaining the ability of educators and communities to act on the systems that perpetuate the climate crisis, we think and we hope that the three main ways of doing this are overcoming climate or science disinformation, centering anti-racism and systemic equity, and really personalizing and localizing climate change action. This is the third of our workshop series. We will have more throughout the winter and spring, but at this point, I do want to go ahead and turn it over to Kristen to share what is COP27 and why should educators connect it to their students.
Hey everyone, welcome this afternoon. It's super good to see you all here. As Seths said, I'm Kristen Poppleton. I'm the Senior Director of Programs at Climate Generation. And I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and current lands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. And I am here to talk to you about what the heck is COP, as you've heard. My plan this afternoon is to kind of do a little run through of what the heck is COP, what's happening there, why is our organization connected with it, and then share a few activities and a toolkit that might be useful in your educational settings, and as well as maybe some extensions as well. So let's kick it off with just the next slide, which is just an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about Climate Generation's window into COP program. As an organization, Climate Generation began sending delegations to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Conference of the Parties. And in 2009, we started sending delegations there. Why would a small environmental nonprofit in Minnesota want to do this? Well, it's a really, there's a number of actually reasons why. First of all, we really believe that the experience of attending one of these conferences, and we've witnessed this over and over, is a profoundly impactful and moving experience for those that attend. They are activated because at these conferences, they are actually interacting with people from 197 countries of the world, and hearing how they are being impacted by climate change. And as we know, climate change impacts some communities much more than others, and island nations and developing nations in the world are, of course, at the top of that list. We also feel that it's really important that civil society, folks like us, just normal old people, are at these conferences to share their voice and make it clear to those that are kind of negotiating at these high levels of what's at stake. And so we make a very deliberate choice to send as delegates young people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, folks from island nations, and other really important constituencies that have something to share. And so we find this program to be one of our most exciting, and this opportunity to be one of our most exciting. And it's also just, it's a really important piece of the huge climate change policy and education and engagement picture. Can go ahead to the next slide, Seth. So this year we have sent a delegation of 12 individuals to Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, where the conference is being held. I encourage you to look back. We'll have opportunities for you to read these folks' stories, to look back at some of the webinars featuring them, as well as sign up for future ones if you like as well. Some of them are from, we have a few Minnesota delegates. We have a young woman from Florida, from Atlanta, from Trinidad, from Ireland, from Chicago, Tonga, you name it. We've got a number of different places represented this year. Go ahead, Seth. So let's start from the beginning. With a little 101, because the acronyms that go with this kind of stuff is just mind-boggling, I think. So UNF Triple C, you might hear people say that. What the heck is that? So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed by 198 countries who agreed to work together through the United Nations to tackle climate change. And since that time, you can scroll to the next slide, they have been meeting for over 27 years to work on this. And they have meetings throughout the year, but the largest one is the Conference of the Parties. And so this is the 27th Conference of the Parties, or COP. And parties are signatories, they're countries. So if you hear someone talking about a party, it's actually one of the countries that have signed onto the convention, the UNF Triple C. And so delegates from all over the world come together at these conferences, and what do? They do all sorts of things. We'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to also share one more piece of this United Nations work, if you want to go to the next slide. So as part of this convention on climate change, there's a number of different pieces that are called out as extremely important to take on climate change. Of course, as you may guess, we talk about greenhouse gas reduction. We got to get those greenhouse gases out of the air, or we have to do some adapting in places to the impacts of climate change, all fairly infrastructural sort of oriented actions. There is, though, another piece that is important for this action to occur, and it is actually recognized by the United Nations. And that piece is called Action for Climate Empowerment. And Action for Climate Empowerment encompasses 6 elements that we believe are critical to accelerate that action that we need. And those are education, training, public participation, public awareness, public access to information, and of course, coordination across networks around that. As an organization that is focused primarily on education and public participation, we find this to be pretty exciting that the United Nations, at the United Nations level, it is recognized that the work we do is critical to advance the action that is needed. And this graphic is pretty cool, we think, or I think, because we commissioned it from a graphic illustrator that we met at the Conference of the Parties last year, who listened to kind of what she heard us saying this work was, and created a graphic. And it does some other things that I think are really great too. It centers literally youth and Indigenous peoples. We know that these is the voices that we need to be listening to, where the knowledge is, where the momentum is, where the action is. It includes human rights, transparency, and democracy as integral fertilizers of this work for this to move forward. They're down in the roots of it all. It shows people working together. It shows rural, it shows city, it shows the whole of society working together. So this is a focus of our delegation this year. We look for individuals that are really working at the nexus of Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE as they call it. And we also follow during the climate negotiations how ACE is being actually integrated or legislated in some way as well through policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if you want to move ahead to the next. So what the heck happens at a COP? So when you hear about these like big international policy conferences, I'm sure this is the image that many folks have, or something similar to it. A bunch of people in a room sitting, listening, talking. It looks kind of cool, and you know, there's flags and placards and stuff, but like this is what you think of. And yes, this is definitely what's happening. There are high-level negotiations happening at every COP. They have different sorts of focuses, but it's not the only thing that's happening. So you can go to the next slide. So at a COP, COPs are usually about 2 weeks long. They have theme days that are held during it. Now the conference outside the walls of that sort of those big high-level negotiations is just like any other conference you've been to, except for with like somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people. So it's a little bit bigger maybe. If you've been to AGU, that's pretty big. Maybe it's comparable to that sometimes. But and at that conference, there's presentations that are being done by folks in research and in NGOs and youth and education and energy. And each day they try to kind of focus those presentations. So these are the ones this year that are being focused on the different days. Go to the next slide. The presentations are held, as you can see, in a big, huge conference center. We, over the years, have participated in a number of them. There's also beyond like conference rooms where there's presentations that are official. There's a whole zone of the conference where there are, quote, pavilions. And in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, that is an example of a pavilion. So it's like an exhibit booth, essentially. Some of them will hold up to 50 people for sessions, and some of them might hold 20 or 2. Some are really tiny. And they are paid for. They're used by countries of the world have pavilions, organizations, the US State Department, private industry, some that are there to make you think they're doing climate change solutions. So greenwashing is definitely in full effect at some of these. But they're another place where there's more sessions. I've never actually gotten a number on like how many presentations are going on at one time within a COP, but there's like thousands probably, just because there's so many pavilions as well. You can go to the next slide. You also at a COP, I always think about it being a place where the barriers are just sort of just eliminated. You walk down the hallway and that is indeed my fist bumping AOCs. Like you might just run into AOC in the hallway. Gina McCarthy was up on stage last year when I was there doing a conversation, and up there in the upper left-hand corner is us with Deb Holland. So it's a place where you have the opportunity often to talk with folks, high-level officials, and also hear them speak about how things are going in government. and in other areas too. There is also oftentimes at a COP, a lot of activities that are happening. Oh, can you back up one? Sorry. There you go. A lot of activities that are happening around the city that it's in. And so last year in Glasgow, Scotland, where there aren't major human rights issues going on, there was a march of hundreds of thousands of people through the streets of Glasgow on the weekend. There was other side conferences that focused more on climate justice happening. This year in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, there is a very subdued atmosphere. The only place where you will hear someone perhaps speaking out against things in a strong way, such as the government and human rights abuses, is likely going to be in the United Nations zone. But outside of that, there's a lot of press has come out on the fact that there's a lot of surveillance happening. The app that participants were asked to download onto their phones, actually, it was found out it has spyware in it. So there's some massive human rights focuses that are happening this year that make it a slightly different experience for participants. You can go to the next one. These are some photos from this year at COP from some of our delegates. There's, for the first time ever, a children and youth pavilion. There's been some really exciting presentations coming from it. And this COP is called the Africa COP. Every year they try to hold a COP in a different region of the world. And so this year it's obviously being in Egypt, the focus is Africa, and which is pretty profound. Because Africa is, of course, seeing probably some of the impacts of climate change harder than many other parts of the world. Africa also has the largest population of youth in the world, the continent, and youth voice is definitely integral and critical in this year. Like we're hearing a lot about that. If you want to go again. That artist that I had mentioned had shared with us just what it was like for her coming in this year, obviously out in a desert. Really, she's thinking a lot about this, where they are and what that means to be at a COP, that in a place where voices are being, I think, pushed down, and also just her responsibility as an illustrator to share back what she's seeing. You can go ahead. And this is just the conference center this year. I wanted to share it if you want to see. This is where delegates are hanging out and spending a lot of time. And if you want to go to the next one, I mentioned that each COP focuses on some pretty high level things. This year, after the Paris Agreement in 2015, created basically a rule book of how to hold, it created guidelines on how countries should report on their greenhouse gas emissions, and created a framework for all these other pieces. This is being called the implementation COP. So this is the place where we're actually figuring out how to hold all these things accountable. One of the biggest things that are being talked about is loss and damage. Essentially, this is the mechanism that countries that are seeing the impacts of climate change more than anyone else is asking for to be made official, where they can be financially compensated for, essentially it's a reparations mechanism for the damage that's being caused. And then climate financing, which is helping countries that don't have the resources adapt and be ready for the impacts of climate change. And so we're looking for some real strong mechanisms. And of course, really at the center of that is this idea of human rights. And I'll say that, you know, with our focus on ACE, this action for climate empowerment, under that public participation piece, that's where environmental defenders fall. That's the people, that's our right to march in the streets and say what we think is important and talk to our elected officials. And that is not real in many countries of the world, including, as we know, Egypt. And so there's a call for the COPs now to be held in places where people are able to actually assert their human right. to speak out, because by holding a conference in a place like that, you're already squelching important, feedback that needs to be given to the negotiators while they're doing their work. So if you want to go forward. So we're gonna kind of transition a little bit to sharing of some resources and having you all think a little bit about how this experience of COP, how it might fit in your place of work, where you're teaching, where you're student teaching, where you're, if you're in a different field, how you might bring this into your workplace. But the questions we like to think about here are these big ones, beyond just how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We want to think about who's being impacted around the world, who's responsible for that, who's causing that. What is fair? What does fairness mean? This is a great question for students. And what is it we can do? How does this big, huge, wonky, high level international thing become something that is tangible for a student in a classroom at a local level? And so I wanted to do a quick minute or two for you all to brainstorm yourselves about what you think might be a way that COP would fit into your curriculum, into your classroom, into your educational setting. And I put a document in the chat that is in fact the slides that you're in. And you should be able to double click on one of those bubbles and write in it. And I'd love to see some answers coming out from you all about ways that you see it fitting. And I'll give you a couple minutes here. See people writing. Oh, great. I like seeing some specifics here too. Awesome. Very cool. Cool. Well, thanks for sharing those ideas. Obviously, when I think about these negotiations, when I think about the COPs, climate change itself already is from my perspective, the most intersectional connecting issue you could possibly use in any classroom whatsoever. There is actually a number of climate fiction books too. I see no one wrote anything about English class here, but there's a new one out. Do you remember what it's called, Seth? That Susan was reading. There's one, it's called Ministry of, forget what it is, but it's actually like a forward sort of post-apocalyptic book, those about the planet. There's also some great books that just talk about like a utopian future and that folks have created. Yo, there you go. Yeah, Ministry of the Future. So lots of opportunities for bringing this into a classroom and making it part of your curriculum, not necessarily an extra, but actually using it as a connecting piece. So today, I'm going to scroll to the next one. I'm going to do a little feature on one of our resources, which I'm super proud of. Our education resources coordinator, Marie Fargo, did a phenomenal job of taking a toolkit that had been sort of informal over the years and creating a really beautiful, useful resource that for educators to use. The links, now that you all have links to these slides, so you actually can click on the links that are in the slides later if you'd like. The window into COP27 link takes to information about our delegation, and the toolkit link will take you to where you can download our educator toolkit and resource for free. And there's two kind of components. There's a toolkit that stays stationary, or it's not dynamic, it's stationary, or whatever the word is. And then there'll be a supplementary resource each year that highlights the COP that is happening. This toolkit really takes educators and through them, their students, through impacts and actions that through a global lens, providing background information, similar to what I shared, but a little bit deeper, and activities that folks can use to kind of a sequence of activities And I see on this call a few of my students that are in a course I'm teaching at Hamline University are here. This toolkit I actually have adapted and been using at the higher ed level as a way to get students up to par on what COP is before they actually do an in-depth research project on the COP. And so some of this may be familiar to you folks that are on the call from my class. If you want to go ahead to the next slide, Seth. So the sequence of activities takes you through an exploration of reading some articles about different countries and how they're experiencing climate change. It asks students to create a presentation about that country. And then it takes them to this question of what is an INDC or NDC. So NDCs are the national determined contributions that countries around the world, those parties I mentioned earlier, have decided is going to be how much greenhouse gas reduction they're going to do in their country. So what are they committing to? And then how are they going to do it? And so there is 197 of these to read if you want on the UNF Triple C website. And they are fascinating. And if you are social studies or geography or Spanish or French or any teacher from that teaches a foreign language, they are in the languages of the country in addition to English. And they are really interesting and generally very accessible reading for the high school level, especially. So the students are asked to choose a country to investigate a little bit more deeply. And then go through the creation of what's called a Talanoa dialogue, which is actually developing a story, a climate story of that country that talks about, well, where have they been with climate change? Where do they want to go? And how are they going to get there? And it's a really lovely UN level exercise that was asked by very official people to do, but something that I think is really fun to do with students as well. And then it has students actually do a Talanoa dialogue together. So we're going to go through just a little activity here while also learning a little bit about just one of our delegates actually this year. If you want to scroll to the next slide. We're going to listen to, I think it's about a 5-minute interview here. So Sahela is one of our delegates. She is actually Egyptian. She's currently a student in California. And she is over in Egypt right now at COP, doing some learning and meeting and mixing around with other delegates. And she happened to meet this young woman from the Ukraine and do a little short interview with her just about her experience. And so what I was thinking is we could kind of go through that activity I had mentioned from the toolkit, a little bit adapted by using a Padlet. So I'll throw it in here. And hold up. Oh, there it is. Great. Thanks, Seth. So there's a link there for you to click on, and that should take you to a map. And if you go to move in that map to the Ukraine, you'll notice on the map on this, if you've clicked on it, there's like a pink X or plus in the corner of the map. Choose a place somewhere in the Ukraine while you're listening to go to, and you could just write Ukraine if you want. And it will create a box for you to write something in, to attach a picture, to put a link, anything like that. And as you're listening to this interview, I want you to be thinking about these two questions. How does climate change and war intersect? How is climate change actually the great escalator of issues that are already happening? And what is going on in the Ukraine? What are other important things happening that are related to climate change impacts and also solutions? So the 2 questions are up there. There's no right or wrong. It's more just kind of having an activity to do while you're listening to this interview. But it'd be fun for y'all to just engage with this activity while we listen to Sahela interview. I forget what her name is, but we will hear. Seth, I think you have to unmute yourself. No sound.
No sound, huh?
Let's see. Noise suppression is disabled.
Oh, let me just stop sharing for just a quick second. I know what I did wrong. I apologize, everybody.
That's okay.
And I'm here with Diana. And basically, we are going to talk about some of our experiences going through COP. So yesterday was the first day of COP. We were really in just, wandering around the Blue Zone. Today, we were fortunate enough to go to the New York Times event, the Extreme Hangouts event, and just like stroll around there. And something that I definitely have been noticing is that the topic of the Ukrainian war keeps coming up over and over again, and what that means not only for Ukraine, but also for the rest of the world, the climate, and etc. And I just think it's so lovely that you're from Ukraine and maybe giving us your perspective, like how do you feel about the fact that the Ukrainian war keeps coming up and again?
As a Ukrainian citizen, I really am very appreciative of every opportunity. The topic of war in Ukraine is being spotlighted so that to raise greater awareness and better understanding, informing about the current state of the development of war and the negative effects it has, not only on social aspect and lives of Ukrainian citizens, but also the environment.
Yes. And speaking of the environment, so basically for those that are unfamiliar with how the Blue Zone is usually structured, there are a lot of different pavilions, and especially country pavilions. So a country is able to actually have their own pavilion with their own just like set of topics that they want to talk about. And Ukraine has its first pavilion at COP27 this year. And I think that is just so like eye-opening to viewers to really see the effect of war on a climate lens. So yeah, do you want to like take them through what the Ukraine pavilion looked like a little bit? So I remember when we first walked in, there were all these soil types. So do you want to talk about that? Yeah.
Right. So the pavilion really is a work of design, right? Each pavilion in COP. And Ukrainian pavilion had to emphasize the topic of war that basically defines the lives of Ukrainian people, and connect that with the topic of climate change and negative effects on the environment. And in Ukraine, we're so proud of fertile Ukrainian soil, right? And Ukraine is very famous for being top exporter of so many staples and grains, rapeseed oil, sunflower oil, and so many more. And being a large world leader in producing agricultural products, the quality of our soils and different kinds of soils are exposed in Ukrainian pavilion.
Wow. And then after that, I think there was the screening videos. And I think that was where I was like, oh my goodness, there's just so much that has just happened on, like, obviously in terms of like the consequences on the people, but as well as like the overall land and the biodiversity. So Ukraine has so much like agricultural land that they use, and because of the bombing and the fires, this has totally been affected. And did you want to just like talk about any of that?
I think indeed very powerful messages come across so many different zones within the pavilion. Goggles allow you to really experience what it is like to be a Ukrainian citizen in cities affected most by war. That were completely destroyed, seeing all this infrastructure, apartment buildings, and basically how Ukraine looks like today.
Yeah. Yeah, I went through there's a VR experience that you just put on a pair of VR glasses and it takes you through major cities that have been completely destroyed because of like the bombs. And it just like really puts into perspective how much there is left to build and like to really like get back to what it was like before. Yeah, so it's definitely a very ongoing and like long-term topic, but in the meantime, I guess, what are you looking forward to, either like in terms of like just COP27 or about like the Ukraine discussion in general?
Right. The key topic is fossil fuels, as that being not only having negative effect on climate change and the state of our environment globally, but also the money that allow all these wars and the armed conflicts. So speaking about this during the COP, making the decisions, pushing through different kind of mechanisms, politically, economically, on putting an end to fossil fuel era is key.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, so with that, we hope that you're still following like the COP27 updates. Young people are really pushing for fossil fuel divestment in general, as well as loss and damage is a really, really big topic that people keep bringing up, especially because they were just talking about like a finance plan for it. So, I mean, no better way to think about loss and damage than like what's going on in Ukraine right now. So hopefully we'll see some progress with that. But thank you so much for sharing your experience, and thank you guys for watching.
All right. I'm going to give you all a moment to at least put one dot on the map that says something about what came out of that conversation. Seth put something on, so I'm going to give him an A+. Thanks, Danielle. It's somebody who was trying to put it on, but anyone else have one to throw in? If they can't put it on the map, they can put it in the chat. Oop, I see. Oop, they're popping in. So, oh, Danielle. Agriculture impacted by war. Yep, I heard them talking about the agriculture piece as well. It's actually interesting that actually Seth had written before the video started that he lived in a place that was coal factories everywhere. So just this resources and the never-ending sort of cycle of the need for fossil fuels in our resource system, and also how they drive war as well, and destruction in that respect, not just because of the climate crisis. So, well, thanks for trying it out. We can go back to the slides, Seth, if you want. And it's 3:45. I just wanted to highlight one other activity that is in this, and we're not going to actually play the video, but it is linked in the toolkit. So as I mentioned, this Talanoa dialogue is something that was introduced at the COP, I believe 3 or 4 years ago, when it was actually hosted by Fiji. Talanoa is a process of sitting in a circle and sharing your story, and sharing, as for this instance, where you've been, where you want to go and how you're going to get there. And they had asked countries from around the world, since they were the host country, to do this, to create their own Talanoas, to hold Talanoas, to create this really very equitable dialogue about how and what needed to happen to address climate change. So that's pretty cool, I thought. And the activity then, of course, is asking students to go through that. And so if we had a little bit more time, I might have us do slide 1, but actually, let's do slide 1. I'm going to skip slide 2. I'm going to ask you all, you have this links to the slides. This is slide 28. Everyone to think about, where do we want to go as a country, as a nation, or as your community? Where do you want to go? What does the future look like to you when you think about taking on this issue? So beyond this super high level international policy, where do you want to be? Let's say in 10 years, where do we want to be? And I'll give you a couple minutes. No more climate change denial. Love it. Informed population. Sustainable solid waste management, renewable energy, absolutely. Local community access control to resources needed to sustain life. I love it. Renewable energy, move away from fossil fuels and not such a divided nation. Building it into hazard mitigation planning, great answers. Obviously, this is we believe organizationally, and we know as climate change education professionals, the solutions lens and a solutions focus is integral to when we talk about climate change. And one of the things I think that's really important when teaching about these international policy negotiations is that this is not the place that all the solutions are going to be done. In fact, very few are. Very few, something I actually hadn't mentioned earlier, I think, is that one of the pieces of these discussions, of the rules that they put forth, first of all, they're not legally binding, but second of all, in order for an agreement to occur at the UN level, it must be by consensus. And so what that means is 197 countries have to agree on what comes out. And so I always actually feel fairly optimistic about the whole whatever comes out of it, because that means that they agreed on something. But it also means that there's a lot of concessions that are made. What we can learn from these negotiations, though, are the really prescient, important things that should be addressed at any level. And so when we talk about loss and damage, thinking about what that means at the level of the community where we live, what does it mean to be compensating and supporting communities that are being impacted most by climate change in our community? How are we centering their voices in this work? How are we financing the ability to actually adapt and to the climate change that is coming for sure, regardless of if we stop emitting fossil fuels today? And so how do we take these high-level processes, these high-level discussions, and make them local? And so if you want to scroll to slide 30, Seth. I wanted to also just highlight a few resources that I think are really great. I'll start with the World Climate Simulation Game. It's a simulation that was developed at MIT. There's also an energy-oriented one as well. This simulation takes students, or whoever's doing it, adults do it. In fact, it's been used at state and country levels to learn about what solutions can be implemented. And basically you decide how you're going to limit greenhouse gas emissions by how much. across the world in different regions, and then you see if you can make your goal. Of course, our goal is 1.5 degrees, and what you find is that it's fairly difficult to do those sorts of negotiations. As I mentioned, consensus, right, at a consensus level. Climate Action Tracker is a pretty cool website that's actually looking at those NDCs that I mentioned earlier, if they're actually being, what it means, what the commitments equal. So if everyone did what they said they would do, and then also what everyone actually is doing. And so it's tracking that. This COP27 resource Padlet is a resource Padlet of links and places that are organized, that is mostly being used by this course that I'm currently teaching at Hamlin, but anyone is welcome to click on it. It's being updated throughout the COP. And then, of course, we'd love for you to subscribe to our digest. It is going out every other day for the next week and a half now. It features stories and video and and pictures, and our illustrator that I showed you from earlier is actually following one delegate a day and capturing them visually. It's pretty cool. So if you'd like to register for that. And then if you want to go to the next slide, register now if you want. We've got a really cool report out tomorrow. We have a group of high school students, and their teacher, who are, two of them are delegates of ours this year, that are reporting live from COP about what they're learning. If you have a classroom, we have classrooms coming in. It's a great opportunity to bring your students. And then we also have another live from COP webinar happening next Thursday from our delegates that are there. So it should be exciting. And I'm going to stop right now and see if there's any questions. I know Seth has a couple tie-up slides, but otherwise, see if there's any questions from the group. Remembering that I am not an international policy expert, but I can fake it sometimes. And you can write them in the chat or unmute yourself, please. I'm modeling wait time right now. All right, well, if you think of any, pop them in the chat. Seth, if you want to finish up with the slides that we have.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Kristen, for joining us today and giving us kind of an overview of what the Conference of the Party is all about and how educators can support their students in learning about it, participating in it, all of that. As I mentioned, this is our third workshop as part of our Teach Climate Network, which is our network of about 8,000 plus educators across North America that we provide professional development opportunities, whether it be workshops like these, monthly newsletters with resources and tips and strategies for incorporating climate change into every subject area. And so if you're not already a member of the Teach Climate Network, you can click on this link. I'll also throw it in the chat before we're done. Our next workshop will be Wednesday, December 21st, and is looking at overcoming barriers to teaching climate change in the classroom with National Council of Science Educator Teacher Ambassador Andy Epton, who is a middle school science educator at the Henry Ford Academy in Dearborn, Michigan. Again, if you need that QR code or direct link to our windows into COP, you can find it there. And then, of course, we always love if you're interested in following us on social media. And overall, yeah, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. And again, if you have any questions, let us know. Yeah, thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you at future professional development opportunities.